Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Making Downtowns More Inclusive, Ideas for Inclusion. We are bringing this webinar to you from the American Downtown Revitalization Review, the ADRR. We are the Center for the Living City, and we are your hosts. My name is Maria MacDonald, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for the Living City. And I have Chelsea Gauthier here. She's the Associate Director of the Center for the Living City. Excuse me. I will be your moderator. And I'm just grateful to be here. We have a wonderful panel for you, and we have some really great questions we're going to be talking about and answering. And then at the end of the talk, we will be taking questions from the audience, from you. So what we're going to do first is David Milder, who is the editor of the American Downtown Revitalization Review, will be introducing the conversation and some with opening remarks. And then I will introduce the panel to all of you. And then away we go with our questions. And it's an hour-long webinar. So around 1:45, 1:50, we'll stop and we'll take questions from everyone. Okay? All right, David.
Thanks, Maria. Wow, I think this is great that so many people are interested in this very important topic. The ADRR, the American Downtown Revitalization Review, now you see why that acronym is necessary, is a new journal that's focused on downtown revitalization. Early on, several of our board members became very interested in having something really meaningful done on how to increase inclusion in our downtowns. We considered doing a special issue, but after more conversation, we decided that doing something like this kind of Zoom session would be much better. Unfortunately, being a young organization and fairly impoverished in both skills and finances, we didn't have the wherewithal to run this session. One of our board members, Stephen Goldsmith, who is also with the Center for the Living City, suggested bringing them in and having them take over the management of the session. And so the two organizations joined to get engaged in this endeavor. Obviously, the center also considers the issue of downtown inclusion very, very important. Inclusion is a very multidimensional topic. It has racial, ethnic, and equity and income aspects. And so we don't expect that it's going to be exhausted by just one a Zoom session, or even a few, or even some publications. So our objective here is to start some conversation threads that we hope that others will pick up with and expand upon. And we expect both organizations will be doing other things like articles or events on the same topic in the future. We start with the premise that making our downtowns more inclusive is a desirable objective. So our objective here and our main focus is how can we achieve that through in meaningful and effective ways. While inclusion is an issue that is certainly societally wide, we're focusing here on downtowns, which is related to our areas of expertise and experience. We have a great panel, and so without further ado, Maria, why don't you take over the reins again, and we can get to the meat of this session. Thank you, and have a great session.
Thank you, David. It's my pleasure. So I'd like to introduce our panel to you. First, we have Davon Barbour from the Hollywood Partnership. Devon is Vice President of Advocacy and Economic Development for the Hollywood Partnership. He is a passionate urban advocate and possesses more than 20 years of progressive leadership in catalytic economic and community development. His areas of expertise include public and private partnerships, business attraction, retail, revitalization, public policy, and research. Thank you for being here, Devon. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Next, we have David Feehan of Civitas Consultants, LLC. David is a world-recognized expert in downtown revitalization. For more than 40 years, Theon has provided leadership and management to successful downtown and business district organizations, founded and directed a technical assistance center for community development organizations and a public policy organization, and taught at 2 universities. Welcome, David.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Stephen Goldsmith of the Center for the Living City. Stephen Goldsmith spent 20 years directing a nonprofit that created affordable, live-work, mixed-use space in downtown Salt Lake City before becoming the city's planning director prior to the 2002 Winter Olympic Games. He later served as the executive director of the Center for the Living City, which he co-founded with Roberta Brandes-Gratz and Jane Jacobs. He is now senior advisor with the center. Hi, Stephen.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Larisa Ortiz of Streetsense. Larissa brings over 20 years of experience advising public, private, and nonprofit sector clients on retail, real estate strategy, and urban environments. Prior to joining Streetsense, Larissa founded Larisa Ortiz Associates, leading award-winning projects including the City of Cambridge, Massachusetts retail strategy, the City of New York's commercial district needs assessment, and the formation of the first business improvement district in Latin America. Hey, Larissa. Thanks for being here. Hi. Okay, so now I'm going to ask some questions to the panel, and I'll ask them in order, each one of you. I'm going to start with Devon. So Devon, what does inclusion mean to you?
So inclusion for me means the space in which participants in a community can meaningfully engage in that environment and are welcome to take advantage of all the full opportunities that exist.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. David, what does inclusion mean to you?
I think inclusion includes not only the question of people of color and ethnicity, which David Milder talked about, but also includes women. And I think for me, inclusion is a very broad topic that applies across the board to all aspects of downtown leadership and ownership.
Great, thank you. Stephen?
I agree with both of those, and I think that inclusion is actually a process. Mm-hmm. I think inclusion is a process of engagement. It's a process of understanding our position and our place, and always asking the question, who isn't here that should be here? You know, we do that even in a social setting, right? If we're looking for at a dinner party and somebody's not talking, how do we include them? So I think inclusion is a way of being, and it is a process.
Sure. Great, well said. Larissa.
It's a difficult question. It means so many things to so many people, right? That's the sticky challenge that we have. And when I think about the questions I'm often asked by communities around the issues of inclusion, it's about making sure that the businesses, the business owners are diverse, that we are welcoming of our immigrant entrepreneurs, for example. In so many downtowns, particularly, I'm familiar with downtowns in New York and the tri-state region. Central American immigrants have moved, located into businesses, live downtown, work downtown, and they should really be credited with maintaining these downtown environments as thriving places. Inclusion, making sure that they participate, engage, and they benefit from growth in downtown, I think is really important. And then the other piece of that for me is inclusion. It means a seat at the table. We have so many structural impediments to participation among the stewards of downtown, whether it's the public sector or whether it's a business improvement district. Oftentimes the voices who are in charge don't necessarily look like the community around them. And so how do we make sure that we have business owners of all types and sizes? How do we make sure we have residents who have a seat at the table and a say in what downtown looks like and how it responds to their needs?
Yep. Well said. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get into some bigger conversations here. This question, I'll start again with Devon. Do downtowns play a role or have a responsibility in inclusion? And if so, how?
Oh, absolutely. I love this question. As someone who's an economic developer, it's been really exciting for me to see many downtown organizations take a stronger interest in economic development in recent years. We've seen this dramatic transformation and revitalization of downtowns all across the country. We're seeing adaptive reuse of buildings. People are moving back into our downtowns. And as Larissa pointed out, very often there might be individuals that aren't necessarily at the table and participating in that process. And I would say downtown organizations absolutely have a role to play. Downtown organizations cannot afford to just sit back and just watch the process take place, but really use their influence to enact change in the environment. And I think there are several ways to do this. When Stephen, when you asked the question about what does inclusion mean, he said, who's missing from the table? And that's a question I think all downtowns have to ask themselves initially. So if we just pick out one sector, for example, in terms of the revitalization of our downtowns, real estate, we know that true wealth creation is created through land ownership and real estate development. And if we look at who are the developers in our community transforming those spaces, there may more often than not, minority women-owned businesses are missing from that ownership status. And so I would say, what are some opportunities that downtown organizations can play to broker relationships with minority developers with larger opportunities, creating apprenticeship opportunities, working with the local jurisdiction also to implement changes in ordinance that may be cumbersome. For example, one example specifically in terms of construction, we know that bonding is often an issue for minority women-owned businesses as they're looking to take on larger capital projects. Well, downtown organizations can play a role in terms of advocating for changes in that system so that they can participate in that process. During my time in downtown Baltimore, we experienced such tremendous growth within the downtown. And so, again, we knew that real estate was so important to wealth creation. And so we curated a number of events. One of our signature events was our real estate reception. And we made it a point to seek out minority women-owned developers, bring them to the signature event. More often than not, we would set aside funding within our budget as well to provide sponsorship opportunities because we wanted to be sure that they had a seat at the table. And so that's just one tangible example of how downtowns can play a role in terms of inclusion.
That's terrific. Great. Thank you. So to David, do downtowns play a role or have a responsibility in inclusion?
Absolutely, they do. I want to talk about a couple of things. One is I want to talk about Minneapolis particularly because that's my hometown. But I think Davon, I think you kind of stole my thunder because I was going to make a lot of the points that you made. When I came to the International Downtown Association in 2001. We looked around the table and we said, there's a big question, who owns downtown and who designs downtown? And if you look at the ownership of property throughout the IDA world, what you see is ownership is almost exclusively white males. And so, Devon, as you mentioned, the opportunities we have here are to find ways to diversify the ownership. Because it's who sits at the table when the decisions are made, who sits at the table when the hiring of a new bid director is underway. If the people all around the table all look like me, the likelihood is they are not going to pick somebody that doesn't look like me. And that's, it's a matter of comfort. It's not necessarily a matter of hatred or animosity. It's a matter of just comfort, I would say, in many cases. The issue of who sits in that leadership position with a bid or chairs the downtown organization, these are the decision makers. They set the tone. And what we found when we were working on the book, Design Downtown for Women, was that even women who work in firms, like architectural firms, urban planning firms, the culture is often male dominated. And so the decisions that they make or the input that they give is often colored by the fact that the person that's in charge of the company is setting the tone. And so the viewpoints of people of color and women in organizations are not valued because the person in the C-suite is setting the tone. So I think leadership is critical. And finally, back to Minneapolis is what you were saying. I've been working with Steve Kramer, who's president of the Minneapolis Downtown Council. And the issue of race there goes way beyond downtown. It's really, we used to say at IDA, downtown is everybody's neighborhood. Well, it's clear that young people of color, particularly young Black kids in Minneapolis, don't feel like downtown is their neighborhood. They look around at who owns the businesses, who owns the buildings. They don't see people that look like them. So this goes beyond downtown. It goes to the way the whole community deals with the issue of race and inclusion.
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Stephen.
I think that along with who's not at the table and the responsibility that the exclusive downtowns have in inviting people to engage and having them feel a sense of belonging is what's not downtown. Depending upon the scale of a downtown, they may have lots of high-end housing, and there may be all kinds of service workers who are part of the downtown, but there's no housing for them. They're forced to live in a suburb, perhaps, or they're not in the downtown. So inclusion includes such things as the responsibility for inclusionary zoning. And then inclusionary zoning is not just for the people who live there, but also inclusionary zoning for businesses. So often we see businesses that are pushed out. Jane Jacobs used to talk to us about her observations of immigrant neighborhoods in Toronto, where maybe a Sudanese family would come and they would set up a business that turned an underserved area into something that was really thriving, maybe because of food that they brought or some other skills that they brought. And then the owner felt, wow, this is really valuable. People want to be here, raise the rents, they were forced out. And there was no tool that was there for them to either have a sense of ownership or to continue their business because the system pushed them out. So I think inclusion, along with individuals, is about space. And that also includes public space. The public space that is oftentimes being privatized is another risk we need to be mindful of. And so we need to make sure that we're always including that democracy of the street, that democracy of urban spaces. And I would want to make sure that in any conversations about inclusion, we go not just with people, but with space.
Yeah, I think you're speaking right to Larissa's point too. Larissa, this is a good lead in for you, especially with your experiences with zoning and placemaking. Would you like to just continue that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I also want to react to what I heard, and maybe be a little bit of a devil's advocate here. And I'm curious, sort of, what my colleagues think about this. I've been working in the bid world for almost 2 decades now, and there is a structural impediment to inclusion that is baked into what a bid is and what a bid does. And I want us to talk about that. Bid formation and bid structures are about addressing value, land value, property values for downtown stewards, for property owners. Ultimately, that is one of the primary goals. That there's friction there. Let's not ignore that. There's friction when we have a homeless population that might be infringing. And we've recently done work in two southern cities, large southern cities, where one of the most significant issues that business owners mentioned was the homelessness and the concerns that business owners raised. And this is them raising it, not me, right? But we have to acknowledge that what does inclusivity look like when there is a concern about that? How do we address that? And frankly, I ask, we may say bids have an obligation to do this or they should do it, but is this because this not because of the goodness of their own heart? They have to understand what it's doing to their property owners and their businesses. And so I want to throw that back to the other speakers and sort of ask the question, what do you think about this friction? How do bids overcome this? Should they, or is that are they the wrong entity to be trying to address this issue? Because it's not their responsibility ultimately at the end of the day.
You want?
So I guess I'll jump in here. I think, Larissa, you raised an important detail. There is this healthy tension that we face. And so I don't believe that downtowns necessarily have to take on and solve all of these problems, but there is a role for different stakeholders in our community. As an economic developer, as you mentioned, certainly my role is to continue to increase value within the community and attract businesses within the community. And so I can't ignore the fact that a property owner is complaining that there's someone homeless in front of their sort of storefront. At the end of the day, I still have to help them lease that space. And so, I'm quite empathetic. I certainly understand that as a mortgage holder, as a business that's got to pay my mortgage, that has to fill that space. I can't lease that space when there's when there's a homeless individual in front of the storefront. That doesn't mean that I'm heartless and I don't care. I'm aware of the situation, and my role is to try and work with other stakeholders in the community to address that community, because ultimately it does impact value in a vibrant area.
And
if I throw into that mix, if I may, that for many people who are facing homelessness, it's not that they're homeless because downtown may be their home. It's that they're houseless. And that languaging of homelessness and houselessness, I think, comes into focus here, because who's not at the table? If downtown is their home, maybe working with homeless service providers, people who are doing harm reduction, maybe even inviting someone from a homeless camp who might talk about their experience and how they might be more integrated into those communities, because they're just houseless. They're not homeless. So I think this sensitivity that we're really bringing to this conversation is important, because downtowns should be for everyone. And how do we make that safe for everyone? For that business owner, for the person who doesn't have a place to live. And these are the ongoing questions, which is why I mentioned that inclusion is a process. And never before have I seen that process more necessary than it is right now.
I think in addition to that, Stephen, the model that I've seen that addresses this in maybe a better way is, I worked in Des Moines, and there was an umbrella organization, a community partnership that staffed and managed the bid. But the bid was only one component of that. The bid took care of maintenance, marketing, and basic management. But a community partnership that oversees the bid, and maybe some other entities, maybe an events corporation, maybe a social service organization, that kind of a partnership can take a wider view than simply monetary value of the businesses and properties. And that seems to me a viable alternative in a lot of cities that have created that kind of structure.
I almost see bids as the quarterback, together with the public sector. In thinking about the answer to this question, the question of homelessness certainly came up in Times Square for instance, many years ago, as the redevelopment of Times Square was going through its process, and partnership with nonprofits who are building housing for those without homes was an important piece of the revitalization effort, but it wasn't necessarily led directly by the bid. There was a partnership, a recognition that issue needed to be addressed, and collaboration with organizations who could take that on. And ultimately the businesses benefited from a solution that also helped the homeless. I think those are the examples that we want to elevate and share. I mean, that's just one issue, the issue of homelessness. But I think it's a provocative one, because the thing is, one everybody can is a challenging one for businesses, for sure.
Right, and it's very visible. You see homelessness. Yes. Mm-hmm. Devon?
I mean, street furniture comes
Yeah, I was just going to, build on to what Larissa is saying. It's probably not popular, but I do think, there's this contradiction between saying, downtowns are for everyone. And very often there's an expectation, particularly on the side of ownership, that downtown is a gated community. Mm-hmm. And those two are in conflict, when you think about from the retail that we're trying to serve, from a market standpoint, I know that Larissa lives in this world as well, retail isn't necessarily defined or drawn based on a political boundary. It's based on a market. And so others that may not live in downtown, they may take part in the commerce that lives downtown. So I found that to be an issue over my time working within downtowns.
It's a real one. How do you convince your property owners that it's in their interest to address these diversity inclusion issues?
Yeah, it's important, I think, to define terms a little bit here too. Not every downtown organization is a bid, and not every bid is a downtown organization. So when we're using the term bid to define what we're talking about today, I think we ought to be clear that we're talking about other kinds of organizations too. And you look at the assessment districts that are being created, there's tourism assessment districts and arts assessment districts and all kinds of other quasi-bid organizations. And I think it's important for bids to be clear about who they are and not try to be what they're not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So, well, this question is going to lead to the next question, and we started to just touch on it. So from that, this next question is from the previous question about the role and responsibility of downtowns. What's going wrong? What are the problems with downtown? I'll just go around again. Devon?
What's going wrong with downtown? We talk a lot, particularly in the world of the International Downtown Association and business improvement districts around the country, that downtown organizations are being expected to do more with less.
Okay.
And so for me, I think that's one of the things that's going wrong, and that these organizations, just in terms of the growing number of challenges that face our communities, the expectation that these organizations can solve all problems and be all things to everyone. So that's what I would say is going wrong.
David?
I think that one of the big issues that bids are facing, downtown organizations are facing, is partners in terms of local government are really under stress right now. They're under stress because of police issues and police community conflicts. They're under stress because of budgets. I know in Minneapolis, the city budget was expecting $10 million this year from parking revenues. It's not going to see a dime from parking revenues. So can the city deliver its responsibilities in terms of downtown when its budgets are being cut? That's one issue. And I think the other thing that happened is and particularly in Minneapolis, those public spaces, the public realm, if you will, is changing in the way people are using it or not using it. And the Nicollet Mall, for example, which is an iconic space in downtown Minneapolis, is now a place where teenagers hang out and homeless people hang out. And that means that people who work in offices every day are very reluctant to come to work in this office space. I think the last number I heard was about 10% of downtown employees are actually coming to work in downtown. And that has all kinds of impacts on restaurants, on parking operations, on lots of other things. So I think we're operating in a very different world today as a result of the pandemic and other social causes.
Sure. Stephen, any thoughts?
Yes, I think that we are operating in a very different world today. And I think one of the questions we might ask ourselves is the idea of a downtown actually archaic now? You know, downtowns are very porous places. Some cities have what they'll call the East Downtown, the West Downtown. There'll be the financial district of downtown. There's the art district of downtown, and they're very porous places. And I think to Devon's point about this exclusivity, there's usually a group of people, they've historically, as we know, been white males who've decided this is downtown.
Mm-hmm.
This is the boundary. Planners map those downtowns and they get all kinds of benefits that somebody who's on the edge of that downtown may not have, or they may actually have penalties that's another area may not have. They may have a different taxation, for example. So I think we may want to ask ourselves, where is my downtown? So here in Portland, which is having, as you all know, extraordinary problems with its downtown area, there are a number of downtowns. There's Mississippi Avenue, there's Alberta, there are all of these downtowns for individuals. And I think this idea of the downtown in cities is part of the problem. That diversifying where downtowns are in walkable neighborhoods. I have my downtown in my neighborhood. It's my 15-minute walk. I think these are questions we might want to add. We might want to ask about the diversity of places and the diversities of use. And especially at a time when so much of the retail is now online. I think the ideas of downtown as retail places is also changing. So these are lots of questions that are being raised. I don't think we have answers, but I think we have lots of questions to raise about inclusion, about porosity, and about the public domain, as Dave was just describing. So maybe the idea of downtown is these exclusive places, the private club of business may need to shift.
And I would say, you know, when we talk about the problem, well, COVID is the problem right now. You know, and it's really accelerated a number of trends that we saw even pre-COVID that were making it harder for small businesses to succeed. And again, sort of my perspective of inclusion that I shared at the beginning was about making sure that downtowns can be places for small businesses and big businesses. And you know, one thing I will say that is my incredible pet peeve. I sit on the City Planning Commission for the City of New York. So I see this all the time, and I'm, you know, people are probably tired of hearing it. We are overzoned for retail. You know, there is a knee-jerk reaction among many planners. I'm an urban planner by training, that ground floor retail is the mantra, and there should be ground floor retail on the first floor of every single mixed-use building that we build. There's a finite amount of discretionary spending that is out there in the world, you know, in any given place. And there's only so much retail that we can support. And for too long, we have not done the math, and we have supported ground floor retail requirements, you know, retail zoning on the ground floor. Now we've built ourselves into a real problem. So, you know, as spending is shifting in different ways and people are changing the ways that they spend, we have an even bigger problem. And with COVID, creating enclosure of businesses, we have an even bigger problem. And so I think, when we look ahead to what we're going to need to deal with when it comes to changing downtown environments, the underlying zoning and this desire to see ground floor retail everywhere, we're just going to have to revisit that assumption. And often it's ironic. Often a lot of people turn and say, this is a Jane Jacobs philosophy, but we talk about eyes on the street. It could be a stoop. It could be someone sitting on their stoop. It could be, there's so many other ways in which we can get to, I think it's a bastardization of Jane Jacobs philosophy, actually. And we have to think about it in a much more sophisticated way. And if we create concentration and co-location of retail and support retail density, we're helping businesses of all types and sizes and small and big entrepreneurs succeed. So that is like a really big issue. And I will say, looking at buildings that are coming before us for approval, I'm often like drumming, the drumbeat on this issue. And, the response is sort of lackluster. It's like, it's not a big deal. Something will fill it. If it's not retail, it will be office space, or it'll be a community facility. That's it. It's not retail. It's going to be a community facility or office space. That's commercial. But that dead ends the street too. There aren't necessarily more eyes on the street because you have an office space with the blinds drawn. So, that's a really, really big problem. And then the other thing, and then I'll shut up, is helping businesses manage and maneuver these changes, right? Pivot, meet the needs of changing customers. That's always an issue, and small businesses have always struggled with that. So those are the two things that I think, are pretty important to address.
Yes, and I think that where you're taking this conversation is very important, and where the Jacobsian ideas are not bastardized, and I think holds an important part of the inclusion conversation, is diversity of use. Mm-hmm. It's a diversity of use over the hours of the day, and especially true in downtowns that go dark. Because when a downtown goes dark at night, that's what decreases safety. That's what decreases the sense of belonging. That's what creates pockets for crime. And when we are in a situation where we have the ability to create policy, one of those things is to understand that downtowns operate 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And how do we diversify them so that they are still vibrant at times when they might otherwise go dark? And to keep that in mind is also something that addresses climate change, because the amount of energy that downtowns consume when they're dark is still extraordinary, because they're having to stay heated, they're having to stay cooled. So when we think about inclusion, I hope that inclusion goes beyond physical structures, beyond the diversity of race and women and all of those other inclusionary pieces that we think of, but also includes our connection to the other processes that cities include: transportation, energy, water, all of those other pieces. So to your point, Larissa, we have a lot more questions to be asking about the inclusionary downtown and the way that it sometimes excludes other programs and processes when it's not thought of in a holistic way.
And if I could just add to what Larissa was saying, one of the things that we find with a lot of smaller, newer, and ethnic businesses is they know what they want to sell. They know maybe even how to produce what they want to sell. They don't have the other skills they need. And having a technical assistance center to assist these businesses to increase their chances of success, because perception is reality. And when people perceive that these businesses fail one after the other, and a space fills up and then the business goes out, it creates an impression that this is a bad place to be, a bad place to locate your business. So one of the things that BIDS could do, or downtown partnerships, or city governments could do, is to provide a richer program of technical assistance to help these businesses.
I could not agree more, Dave. Recently I worked with LA County to administer a COVID-19 regional fund, over $100 million. And, we would provide regular updates to elected officials, and we were seeing disparities in some districts where there was a larger concentration of immigrant or low-income businesses. And, you know, I would constantly get questioned, Davon, why aren't we getting participation in grants and loans from these businesses? And what we found was that often the businesses did not know about the opportunities, or they needed the assistance. And so to compensate for that, we worked with technical assistance providers to make sure that they were working with these businesses to help them get their applications up to speed, and then also addressing some regulations. And I think that's where, you know, we really have to be conscious when we talk about inclusivity, to just have an honest conversation to say, hey, someone's being, you know, limited from the table. What can we do to get them to the table?
Mm-hmm. Yep, this is great. This is actually our fourth and final question, but I'm hoping we, you know, it's a long answer. And the question here is, what are some practical tools that we can start to implement for inclusion now? And how can we access these tools today in meaningful steps? So now let's talk about some solutions or some things that actionable things that we can do that will work to move us into the direction that we're just been discussing. Devon, would you like to continue with that?
Sure, I'll jump in. You know, this inclusion touches so many aspects. And so I'll really focus on economic development, economic inclusion, because I think this is where bids can play a role. And so like Larissa, I have a passion for retail, and we know a number of communities are looking at retail attraction within their communities. Often, and we know that retail, I would say specific retail concepts very much excite a certain identity within some communities. If you think about, for example, what the arrival of a Starbucks meant to a neighborhood, or when you think about when Pinkberry arrived, that was, we've got to have Pinkberry, we've got to have Starbucks. But I think there are ways to work with local entrepreneurs in that community to fill that void. It doesn't have to be a national, it can be a locally owned business. And I think bids have play an opportunity to be much more entrepreneurial. In downtown Baltimore, we had a program called Operation Storefront, where we provided $10,000 grants to minority and women-owned businesses to locate within downtown. We served as a matchmaker, identifying specific uses, partnering with property owners that had vacant space, and bringing those uses into the downtown. We would market them, promote them, do special events, make sure that residents were aware of them, because we wanted them to have a leg up. And so, you know, this is an area where bids can be much more entrepreneurial. You know, I've been on the public side as well as the private side. And so on the public side, I can say, you know, the underwriting requirements typically are really cumbersome. There's a lot of bureaucracy. With bids and with this particular program, we had a chance to be entrepreneurial. You know, a business, it may go under, but you know what? We gave that business a chance. We worked with them and we tried to make sure that they were part of the economy. So I would say looking at programs like that is one way to help bring businesses up within the community. And also just looking at your own procurement practices as well. You know, as downtown organizations, they're longstanding, you know, your legal services, your accounting firm. Well, you may have enjoyed that relationship for 15, 20 years. Why not open it up and try and expose those opportunities to other entities as well, so that they can have a seat at the table and grow?
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Thank you. David, any other tools and advice?
Yeah, I think, again, following up on this idea, I started years ago in Pittsburgh, something called the Community Technical Assistance Center. And we had on our staff a person who is both an attorney and an accountant. We had a marketing expert, and we had an HR expert. And these are the kind of back office services so many businesses need and don't have. You know, maybe I'm really good at opening a coffee shop, but I don't know anything about fringe benefits, and I don't know anything about other requirements that I have to fulfill. I think the other thing that if any of you know about the Eastern Market in Detroit, they are really growing entrepreneurs and helping companies get started that will then become able to move into downtowns. They may start in the neighborhood, but they may find an opportunity, if they're successful, to open a second location in downtown, and that can diversify the tenant mix, because so often what we see in a lot of downtowns is just formula, you know, chain stores, that don't provide the kind of ambiance, the environment that people are looking for in downtown. So I think those are two kinds of tools. And then finally, I would say, what about creating investor groups? Maybe that African-American doctor isn't interested by himself or herself in investing in real estate, but maybe if they're a member of a fraternity or sorority, maybe you can put together an investor group from that fraternity or sorority, and they'll have the wherewithal to actually buy a building, to invest in a business in downtown and create that ownership that's missing right now. So those are three tools that I think we can take a look at.
Thank you. Stephen?
You know, I think this is where it gets kind of fun, actually. We can start celebrating our downtowns. You know, the tools are not just these pragmatic pieces, just as Dave was talking about, as important as they are. But one of the ways this conversation began is the ADRR asked me to write an article, which I did, on Artists as City Builders, Ideas for Inclusion. And it's available on the ADRR website for all of the people who are listening. And in there, I mentioned a project we did, which was called the Temporary Museum of Permanent Change. What it was is just the labeling of downtown as a museum of change. So we created a website, and you could actually download a ticket to the museum. If you went online, you could download a ticket. And that ticket gave you 15% off, and the businesses in downtown who agreed that you could show this, and you could get 15% off. This is a time when downtown was really struggling. And we began to look at the archaeology of downtown as a museum. So the shops became the museum shops, because downtown is just a museum. And there are all this archaeology, the beautiful elements of architecture, for example. We began to see the architecture of downtown, you know, beautiful terracotta, things that you don't see anymore. I'm looking at the wildlife of downtown, right? So it becomes a bit of a natural history museum. So tools for downtown, tools for making them more inviting, giving them a different kind of branding can happen if we do invite artists to the table, not artists as window dressing. And I'm sure we've all seen those examples where the vacant storefront is given over to an artist, which is a great thing to do, but that's artists as window dressing, and they don't usually get paid for that kind of work. But I would invite the audience who's listening to this today to consider that creative, not the creative class, not a Richard Florida creative class, but those authentic creators in a community who can come and help reframe something which may be dying, something which may be celebrated in a different way. So I think if there's bringing people to the table, bring those artists to the table and see what they might be able to do to help jumpstart or reclaim downtowns that are otherwise struggling.
That's great. Larissa?
And I guess I'll start very pragmatically. You know, I think economic development policy is where we should start. And I'm going to focus on small businesses, right? How do we make sure these environments are welcoming to small businesses? You had shared, I believe, or will share some resources from the Commercial Corridor Challenge, which was a program that I helped develop with the Local Initiative Support Corporation. It included the City of New York, and it was funded by Citibank, which was all about helping small businesses address their technical needs and giving them funding for facade improvement. And, you know, so I want to point people to those resources and the ideas that were generated. We helped dozens of businesses throughout the city. But economic development policy, first, I would say, wonderful example in the city of Boston along Washington Street, where there's a policy to support small businesses and publicly owned businesses. And this wonderful bodega, Don Quixote Market, was moved into one of those spaces, got long-term, low-cost lease, and my understanding is that they're still there to this day. Without that support, they would not have been able to remain. The second is zoning. We cannot allow retail zoning to proliferate without giving thought to where we want to support businesses and business activity where we already have businesses. So let's not dilute, you know, the spending. I think that undermines our local businesses. The third is making sure that these businesses have the resources that they need for tenant improvements, to help them be competitive. So many businesses, small businesses, business owners of color did not receive public assistance through COVID. They're notoriously undercapitalized. You know, I think there was 17 days on average the small business has of you know, cash reserves. What happens when you're closed for 3 months? So you know, we have to be in a position to give them the resources they need. And if I were to technical assistance is the next piece. Bilingual support and support navigating rules and regs for immigrant business owners, really critical. And then I want to end on something fun, which I think Stephen said. Let's celebrate downtowns. Let's recognize these are fun places to be, that it's our job to raise awareness of these offerings, bring people there, market them, promote them, you know, do fun placemaking. Those are all strategies that we should be embracing.
I love that. That's a great place to stop for a minute. So we're right around 1:50. We have 10 minutes for some questions and answers. We have a bunch here, so let me just go through them. Let's see. Do we lose Larissa? Her video went out. Okay, so let me see. I'll go through. So this first question came from Michael. I'm not sure if it's Bern or Bernie. It's Berne. He said it's a question for Larissa or Davon. So since I can't see Larissa, I'll go to Davon. See if she'll come back. So much, here it is, Davon. So much of the focus with inclusion as it relates to retail seems to be on ownership, and understandably so. But what are your thoughts about furthering inclusion with regard to consumer draw, which is about the kinds of concepts that comprise the retail mix, as well as the ways in which they feel accessible to a wide range of users?
So I think I love this question. You know, having lived in Los Angeles for nearly 2 years now, one of the things I love about this community is the diversity, which plays out so much within the culinary scene. You know, Los Angeles is a place where there are hundreds of languages spoken, large immigrant population, and we saw that there were some barriers to entry for many of the migrant communities with respect to some of their food carts, street vending opportunities. And so the county orchestrated a process to minimize some of the barriers to allow those businesses to grow. You know, earlier I spoke about the importance of tapping into local talent to create this unique environment. I did some work with downtown Rochester a few years ago, which was experiencing, again, like other downtowns across the country, strong residential growth. And they said, you know, Davon, we'd like to see more retail. Why aren't more nationals moving in? And I said, why don't we focus on the locals? And so we worked with them. And so downtown Rochester has now created a restaurant incubator within the downtown, again, to tap into local opportunities, supporting minority women-owned businesses to cultivate that talent. They don't have to go out of the market. You know, one of the things I think COVID has showed many communities is that the importance of supporting local businesses and that authenticity. And so that's a great example in a tangible manner, how you can support businesses within your respective community to create that environment. And again, I mentioned the Downtown Baltimore Operation Storefront program. Again, providing specific funding to the retail, to that local minority-owned business, helping them navigate the permitting process, partnering with them with property owners. Again, curating that experience. You know, as downtowns, it's up to us to say, what's the retail environment that we want? Talk to the brokers. Let's not just sit back and wait for the businesses to come, but really feed the vision for our community to our brokers, to our property owners.
That's great. Thanks, Davon. Okay, another question. Let's see. I'll throw this one to Stephen. It's from Margie Goldblatt. I am in Chicago and particularly concerned here about the high level of vacancies in our retail space and restaurant spaces. Also, the high level of damage we have had to properties this summer that may have long-term impacts on our downtowns here. Curious how the other major metropolitan areas are experiencing the above, Is Chicago on par with other cities, or are we in worse shapes than others? And how can we bring it back? And what time frame do you think it will happen?
I'm actually going to pass that question to Dave.
Okay.
He's probably much more familiar with those experiences than I am.
Dave?
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, as a matter of fact, I've been in touch with Chicago and been talking with Mike Edwards about the situation there. And also with a number of cities. I created a kind of an informal forum for Steve Kramer in Minneapolis, because Minneapolis, as you know, not only in downtown, had a terrible problem with burning and looting and other issues, boarded up buildings, but Lake Street on the south side of Minneapolis, which was about a half a block from where I used to live, was virtually burnt down during the initial disturbance after George Floyd was killed. And right now, I think the issue is one of, it's back to perception. Businesses aren't willing to take the boards down until they feel the public space has been secured. And right now, in a lot of these communities, the perception is that the public space is not yet under control. So we see a lot of places that are still boarded up. And the other thing I want to mention is there was a young man, well, he's not so young anymore, Brett Mcneil, who I knew from the time I coached him when he was playing boys club basketball, but he's now the athletic director at one of the high schools. Brett is very much working with and in touch with the youth of color in Minneapolis. And he says there's no organization they have. There's no way to get them around the table to negotiate about what's going on. They communicate by cell phone, but it's like an amoeba. There's no entity to talk with. And he said that the issues are power and privilege. These kids don't feel like they have any power, and they don't have the privilege. And as a result, they are willing to create havoc and as he said, kill or be killed. It's a very disconnected, dysfunctional social situation that exists in a lot of these cities that's quite frankly been ignored for too long. And we used to have settlement houses, we used to have organizations with youth workers, outreach workers, and we don't have a lot of that anymore, or it's not very effective. So we've got to find new ways to work with young people, particularly who have been participating in these activities that are very destructive. And that's what I'm hearing from not only from Chicago and other cities, but it's particularly true in Minneapolis.
Okay, thank you, David. We have about 2 minutes left. I'll try to throw one more question, Larissa, to you, and then we'll wrap up, okay? This one comes in from John Shapiro, and it's about bids. So how would you re-legislate bids for inclusion and related values?
Thank you, John. You tossed me a hard question.
Right at the end.
I mean, changing enabling legislation, as you know, is challenging. I think at the very least, require that boards include residents, include and many do include sort of public sector officials as ex officio members. In New York City, for instance, bids that have residential assessments of $1 a unit, that actually gives residents a seat at the table because they are ratepayers, even if it's nominal. So, I think there are ways in which we can restructure that. But I would also say that might not be the right question. Should we continue to lean on bids as the solution to this issue, or should we see them as, one of many stakeholders who play a role in stewarding and managing downtown? I would say that's another alternative to positioning them to be the end all be all on the topic of diversity and inclusion. I know that's not what you were suggesting, but I think we have to manage what we expect from these organizations.
Great, thank you. I knew this hour was going to go fast, and it has. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We will send out an email follow-up for all of you that are listening, and those of you on the waiting list with the transcript from this conversation, the recording, and then some links and some more tools that could continue this very important conversation. This is really just touching the surface, and also keep posted on the Center for the Living Cities website. We will have a series of lectures coming up through February, March, April, May, continuing conversations about cities and post-COVID thinking. So thank you all for being here. And I look forward to continuing this with each and every one of you. Please visit the ADRR, American Revitalization Review. Thank you so much for hosting this. And that's all we have time for. Okay, everyone.
Thank you. Great to be with all of you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Chelsea.